Hey everyone, it's me again. Just wanted to start part 2 of the series called The Truth About Psychiatry, in which I will tell you the truth about psychiatry. The first episode we talked about James Davies' book, the red one back there, cracked the unhappy truth about psychiatry, and just kind of gave you an introduction to how I started or stumbled upon some of these discoveries. And I wanted to follow up with that last video by sharing something that I think that's important from Davies' book. And then I would like to go into the next segment. I've titled this next video The Secret of NIMH. And some of you may be familiar with the cartoon of NIMH, or the book. I think the title is Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of NIMH. You may remember the story of the mother who was trying to heal her son, and there's a bunch of rats who become super intelligent, and a rat named Nicodemus is helping Mrs. Frisbee to find some medicine to heal her son, and she has this magical amulet, or this stone, that she uses to, miraculously help her son. So that cartoon, that book, the cartoon was also called The Secret of NIMH. But that title also has relevance to psychiatry, and we will talk about that. So I'd also like to introduce you to my blog, a blog that I call Psychiatric Survivors. And if you're interested in that title, we'll definitely be talking about why there is even such a thing as psychiatric survivors and what that means. Then further along in the video, I will talk about a man named Robert Whitaker, who this was probably, besides discovering James Davies' book, discovering Robert Whitaker was really the entryway into discovering this whole new world, a world that up to that point in my life had remained completely hidden from me. And I think it's valuable for other people to know about it, because I wish I would have known about it beforehand. So we'll talk about Robert Whitaker and his books, and maybe that will lead into the next segment for the next video that I'd like to do, which we'll talk more extensively about Robert Whitaker. So first things first, let me review from Davies' book something that he said that is important to keep in mind. Let's see if I can find it here. Yes, so this is on my blog, and I'll show you, well, let me just go ahead and show you one of the main pages. This, if I can show it to you, this is a picture of a hand reaching up and a hand reaching out of the water, sort of a symbol of rescue, I suppose. And psychiatric survivors, and let's see if I can get the lighting right. Anyway, it's hard to get the lighting right, but you can see that it's about the truth about psychiatry. So it's I'll put a link to this blog at the bottom of the page eventually. And if you follow along with this blog, the videos and the blog will go hand in hand. Because I recorded, as I was learning, I recorded everything I was learning on these blogs. But back to James Davies, his point at the end of his book, I wrote on my blog, Davies issues a final warning at the end of his book for those who are currently taking pharmaceuticals or those who know someone who is taking them. Quote, while most psychiatric drugs have harmful side effects, they also can have powerful withdrawal effects. Therefore, any precipitous or sudden withdrawal is always dangerous. It is therefore crucial that anyone deciding to withdraw from any kind of psychiatric medication do so under the supervision of an experienced physician who is, of course, well informed and thus able to respect fully any patient's desire to explore non-medication alternatives. So I wanted to emphasize that and reiterate how important that is, even though I disagree with some of the ways that he phrases that. It is very important if you're taking any kind of drug, whether psychotropic or otherwise, that you make sure, if you decide to come off of it, that you do so very, very gradually. You need to taper off if you make the decision to stop taking psychotropic drugs, which I would encourage everyone to do. It needs to be done very, very gradually and very, very carefully. And also, it is very, very painful. It is indescribably excruciating, is how I would put it. And it is no wonder to me that there are many people that I've known and millions of others who have taken their own lives because of the suffering involved. The pain was so excruciating and has been for so many people that they decided death was a better alternative. And I don't blame them at all, because, yeah, I don't blame them. It's really, there's no way to describe how painful it is to come off even one drug, let alone what could be called polypharmacy or multiple drugs. So be very careful with that, because it's dangerous to go on the drugs in the first place, but it's even more dangerous to withdraw from them very rapidly. So there's that. Maybe you're interested in what this shirt is. Maybe you can see here. I have this shirt that I got, Stop Psychiatric Drugging of Kids. So I really advocate for that. I would advocate it for everyone, because, and although I take issue with even the wording of it, I would prefer to call it psychotropic, not just psychiatric, and I'll explain that later. But basically, it already makes me mad enough that psychotropic drugs are destroying the lives of so many innocent people, including the elderly, including the homeless. And when it comes to children, that just pisses me off more than anything. Pardon my French, but it's already bad enough to harm adults. But when innocent little children are being harmed, that's a whole new level of that's a whole new level of making me very mad. And so I'll have more opportunities to talk about that in future videos. But that's kind of a review of the last session. We talked about Cracked, and now I'd like to get into the secret of NIMH, because I also have a post on my blog. This was early on when I first started writing the blog, and I wrote a post called Uncovering the Secret of NIMH. And I got to learn how to do these videos better, but basically you can see the blog post title. So yeah, in this story, Mrs. Brisby is very brave, and there's kind of this refrain that some of you may remember, um, where it says, "Courage of the heart is very rare. The stone has a power when it's there." And I kind of appropriated that nice little saying. Courage of the heart is very rare. Truth has a power when it's there. Um, so the reason I use this little story, The Secret of NIMH, is because there are actual real secrets of NIMH. And what I mean by that, the acronym NIMH, NIMH, stands for the National Institute of Mental Health. And as I explained in my blog post, this National Institute of Mental Health, back when I wrote this, like 6 or 7 years ago, they're a $1.5 billion enterprise, at least at the time. They're probably a lot more now, but their website at the time said their vision was a world, quote, a world in which mental illnesses are prevented and cured, and NIMH endeavors to, quote, transform the understanding and treatment of mental illness through basic and clinical research, paving the way for prevention, recovery, and cure. And so what I point out in my blog post is, on the surface, this sounds like a really noble mission. Like these people are trying to cure mental illness and prevent it, and help all these people. It sounds very noble, but as I've discovered, this organization has a very troubled past. Sort of like the cartoon or the book, The Secret of NIMH, with all those rats. There were actual, real human rats, you could say, involved in the National Institute for Mental Health. So, and where are these discoveries made clear? This was kind of the next step in my journey of discovery, was the man that I mentioned, a guy named Robert Whitaker. And let me show you the book that first helped me in this this ongoing journey. So it's also, I believe, my friend who helped me find Cracked also helped me find this book, Mad in America. So let's see if I can get it up there so you can see the subtitle. Bad Science, Bad Medicine, and the Enduring Mistreatment of the Mentally Ill. So this book was a real eye-opener. And Robert Whitaker, he is a researcher. Trying to see if I can find his actual credentials, because he has some impressive credentials, including working for Harvard and kind of investigative journalism and things like that. Anyhow, you can look him up, and he actually has his own website that is by the same title. It's called Mad in America, and I highly recommend it, because that's where some of the real conversation about these topics is taking place. And what I mean by that is, it's not just the mainstream media. You're not going to, usually in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal even, or even other more conservative websites, you're going to find inaccurate information on this topic. Whereas Robert Whitaker, he's actually delved pretty deeply into the subject of quote-unquote mental illness and psychiatry. And this book, Mad in America, is Whitaker's attempt to write the real history of psychiatry in America. And he does an excellent job, in my opinion, because there have been other books. I mentioned Edward Shorter. He has written some books on the history of psychiatry. but they're very skewed and they're very oriented toward. They take a pro psychiatry stance from the beginning, which I think really clouds their view. Whereas Robert Whitaker, he went in just as an investigative journalist, asking sincere questions and trying to find out, okay, what actually is the history of psychiatry in the United States? So, um, and strangely enough, it looks like I didn't mark up this book. I usually mark up every book I read. But let me just read you a couple of chapter titles or sections. So, part one is Original Bedlam. Bedlam in Medicine, The Healing Hand of Kindness. Part two, The Darkest Era. Unfit to Breed, Too Much Intelligence, Brain Damage as Miracle Therapy. Part three, Back to Bedlam. Modern Day Alchemy, The Patient's Reality, The Story We Told Ourselves, Shame of a Nation, The Nuremberg Code Doesn't Apply Here, Part 4, Mad Medicine Today, Not So Atypical, and then an epilogue. So this book was amazing, and I highly recommend it. And on my blog, in the same post about The Secret of NIMH, I kind of review and outline some of the main points that Whitaker makes in this book. Let's see if I can find any good tidbits to share with you. Basically, the true history of psychiatry in the United States is not one that is usually spoken of or taught, or it's not something that I was aware of before I discovered this book, and I don't think it's something that most people are have really studied in any depth. But basically, I say Robert Whitaker reveals a haunting story of what it has meant to be mad in America. From the bedlam of the 18th century to the subtle and sophisticated pseudoscience of the 21st century and beyond, Whitaker throws down the proverbial gauntlet to past, present, and future supporters of psychiatry. Whitaker's book contains terrible secrets that might have made even Mrs. Brisby's courageous heart tremble. So Whitaker shows some really terrible scenes of patient abuse, or quote-unquote patient abuse, beatings, water torture, solitary confinement. He talks about the Quakers, how the Quakers tried to reintroduce, compassionate treatment of the quote-unquote mentally ill. And, Whitaker also shows that there's psychiatry actually experimented on human beings in a way that some scientists, experiment on rats or guinea pigs, with barbaric treatments, one of which was called insulin shock therapy. Another one is known as electroshock therapy. You may be familiar with that from the famous movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and also the infamous lobotomy. When lobotomies were popular, that's a really, really horrible story if you want to ever study about how those got started and who invented that, and basically there was a guy going around with an ice pick and shoving it up people's nose into their brain and taking out, severing their frontal cortex and, doing all sorts of awful things, destroying people's lives in the name of, treatment. So those are just a couple of things. Then Whitaker also shows in the same book, in Mad in America, in the 1950s, there was a wave of what's called neuroleptic drugs. Now we talk about these drugs as sometimes we call them psychotropic or antidepressants, antipsychotics, that kind of thing. But these neuroleptics were the early drugs, and basically, as Whitaker points out, these chemicals were frequently touted as miraculous cures for mental illness, while patients who ingested them often ended up permanently disabled or dead. Um, and, you know, basically what these drugs ended up doing, one of the early ones was called thorazine, but there's a whole bunch of others, and some of the older people in my audience may remember, like Mama's Little Helper. I think the Rolling Stones had a song about a drug. Maybe it was Valium. Anyway, some kind of drug like that where that was given a lot to women, under the pretext of helping them. So, yeah, basically that's probably a good enough introduction to Mad in America. But there's so much more to the history of psychiatry. Um, the general history of psychiatry, but also the history of psychiatry in the United States in particular. I believe there's some mention of Benjamin Rush, who was one of the founding fathers and I think a signer of the Declaration of Independence, who is often considered the father of American psychiatry. And while I admire Rush for, some of the things that he did in terms of the founding, there are some serious problems with the way he approached medicine, and especially his involvement in psychiatry. There's some interesting stories about his connection to George Washington, and George Washington's final days, and in some respects, the ways in which Benjamin Rush was actually complicit in Washington's early demise. That's an interesting story with a lot more details, but basically, I think Robert Whitaker talks about Benjamin Rush and the beginnings of psychiatry in America. There's just so much from that point on. One thing that comes immediately to mind is you might find this incredible, but in the early psychiatry, there was actually, in one of the early editions of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, there was actually an alleged diagnosis called drapetomania. So what on earth was drapetomania? Drapetomania was supposedly the disease that causes slaves to want to escape. So sometimes when slaves in the South in early America, when attempting to escape, if they were caught, they would be labeled with this disease called drapetomania. So a good slave who's just stayed and did what his master told him, was considered healthy. But any slave who attempted to escape could be diagnosed with the disorder drapetomania. And I'd have to look up the actual etymology of the word drapetomania, but it has something to do with the disease that causes slaves to want to escape from slavery. That's just another thought that came to mind. But Whitaker is really great, and he shows the transition from the barbaric treatments of the early days of psychiatry in America to the more sophisticated, pseudoscientific schemes that replaced like insulin shock therapy and other, water torture, kind of these things that sound like you would think they would only do those kind of things in a medieval torture chamber, but is actually part of their supposed medical treatment. Um, but like I said before, Whitaker mentions how in the 50s that psychiatry began to introduce certain drugs like thorazine and others that came to replace these treatments. Although there's still some areas where electroshock is still considered therapy, and there's still other barbaric treatments that are out there. But gradually, that as the drugs came on the scene, they were kind of seen. The drugs were envisioned as this scientific advancement that was going to, provide the cures for mental illness. So that was an introduction to Whitaker, and I highly recommend Mad in America, and I highly recommend his website too. Let me just bring that up. Make sure I have the right address for it so you can find it. I'll put it in the link below too. And it's just madinamerica.com. This is what it looks like. So you can kind of, oh my gosh, let us see here. Mad in America. I wish I could get it to look better. There we go. That's a little bit better. So this is a great website, and it has some good articles. It has some nonsensical articles, but every once in a while there's a really good article. So I highly recommend that. Whitaker also he's written several books, but the book I'd like to talk about next time is a book called Anatomy of an Epidemic. Okay, and let's see if I can make it so you can see the magic bullets, psychiatric drugs, and the astonishing rise of mental illness in America. So, Whitaker's first book, Mad in America, was great, very eye-opening. His second book, or maybe his third or fourth, because he wrote a couple before this, Anatomy of an Epidemic, is about more recent history. So instead of going into the early history of psychiatry in the United States, this treats, the last, 30 or 40 years, or, going back to the 80s and 90s. And I'd like to get into that more next time, because this book, all three that I've mentioned, the first two that I mentioned were really got me on this path of discovery, but Anatomy of an Epidemic was a real turning point because it helped me to understand. Robert Whitaker was asking some of the very questions that I had been asking, but he had the resources and the wherewithal to find the answers and to record them. And his book is very well written, and I would highly recommend it. He also wrote a book after that called Psychiatry Under the Influence, Institutional Corruption, Social Injury, and Prescriptions for Reform. And this is also very awesome, and I'll hopefully be able to talk about that next time. So I guess thus far in this second episode, The Secret of NIM, we've started to reveal a little bit of the secret of NIM, the secret of the National Institute for Mental Health, that it's not, under the pretext of wanting to help people with quote-unquote mental illness, there's actually a lot of problems with what they do, and Whitaker's exposes a lot of those in his books. I've introduced you to my blog, Psychiatric Survivors. I'll put a link at the bottom. And I've given you the caveat of remembering for you or your loved ones or anyone you know, if you decide to withdraw from psychotropic drugs, that you make sure to do so very, very, very gradually. Um, a little at a time over as long a period as possible. Because cold turkey withdrawal can really cause some horrible problems. So we talked about that, and Robert Whitaker, Mad America, Anatomy of an Epidemic. So let's see. Yeah, I think that's pretty good for this second episode, The Secret of NIMH. As you can probably tell by my t-shirt and by what I have to say about these books, that there's some things about psychiatry and about so-called mental illness that I think need to be more widely understood. And I want to share these resources with you so that you can read them and study it out for yourself, and find out what I consider to be much more accurate information than what the vast majority of people have imbibed as the common paradigm for thinking about quote-unquote mental health. And I'll explain in future videos why I put quotes around things like mental illness, things like mental health, because there's a whole history behind that as well. So if you've enjoyed this video, go ahead and like it and ask some questions or make some comments. Please keep it civil, because I know this is a very controversial topic, and like I said in my first video, my hope is to provide accurate information so that people can make their own decisions. And I have nothing but compassion for anyone who suffers in any way. So I would like to also keep that in mind as we go through these videos. That the purpose is not to deny the reality of suffering, because I know and you know and everyone knows, that's a human being, that life is hard and suffering is real, and people go through terrible trials of all kinds. And so I just keep that in mind as we move forward. And I would be happy to hear from you, and just let me know if you have any questions in particular from these first couple of videos, and I can maybe start to address those in the future. Thanks. Have a good night, and I'll see you soon.